On the evening of September 18, 1988, in a motel room on North Broadway in Santa Maria, California, a man named Jose Alberto Ceballos came home at the end of an ordinary day. He sat down beside his girlfriend. He turned on the television. For about 15 minutes, he sat there next to her the way two people do when nothing is wrong, half watching the screen, half just being in the same room. Then he reached over and tickled her leg, trying to get a laugh out of her. A small gesture. The kind of thing you do without thinking, the kind of thing that means you expect a reaction. She didn't move. He sat with that for a second. Maybe he thought she was asleep. Maybe he said her name. He pulled back the blanket. Ofelia Sandoval, 30 years old, was dead. He called 911. For 36 years after that night, the man who killed her told anyone who asked the same four words. I didn't know her. He said it to a detective within weeks of her death. He said it again in 2024, decades later, to the investigators who finally came for him. He said it even with her photograph sitting on the table directly in front of him, her face looking back at the man who put her in the ground. What finally caught him wasn't a confession, or an eyewitness, or a lucky break in a database. It was a pair of gloves he should never have thrown away. Before we go further, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. And if stories like this matter to you, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. In September 1988, Ronald Reagan was finishing his second term as president. The Soviet Union still existed and would for 3 more years. DNA fingerprinting. The idea that the specific arrangement of a person's genetic code could identify them the way an ink fingerprint could had only been invented 4 years earlier, in 1984, by a scientist in England named Alec Jeffreys. It had only been used in an American courtroom for the first time the year before, in 1987, in Florida. Boarding houses and motels scattered along the edges of downtown, places that weren't built to be homes, but became homes anyway, because that's what people could afford. The town center motel sat in the 200 block of North Broadway, near the corner of East Main. It wasn't a place people stayed passing through on a road trip. Nobody pulled off the highway looking for it. It was a place people lived in because it was what they could afford, month after month, the same room, the same walls, the same parking lot. That was Ofelia Sandoval's life in September 1988. She shared a room there with her boyfriend, Jose Alberto Ceballos, and his cousin, Jose Santos Ceballos. Both men picked strawberries at a local farm. Ofelia was 30 years old. She had 3 children, Marcelino, Maricela, and Alex. Nobody thought a woman living in a Strawberry Town motel room was a story worth writing down. Not until the night someone walked into that room and made sure she'd never tell anyone herself. One of her roommates would later tell police that the last time he saw her alive, she was walking toward their room with a man he didn't recognize. A stranger, or someone only she knew. Nobody ever got a name from that detail. Nobody ever got a face. Santa Maria police officer James Titsworth was the first officer through the door. What he found inside that room was a homicide. Ofelia had been strangled. She had been sexually assaulted. Near her body, on the floor of that small room, a towel, a shirt, 2 pieces of fabric that meant nothing to anyone yet, sitting in a motel room while the strawberry fields outside kept going dark for the night the way they did every night. Detective Bill Marquez took the case. He started working through the names, everyone who knew her, everyone who'd been seen near the motel, everyone whose name came up twice. In October 1988, about a month after the murder, he sat down across a table from a man named Aloysius Winthrop James, a Santa Maria resident at the time, a name that had surfaced somewhere in that first sweep of questions. Marquez had a form to fill out. A few questions. Nothing dramatic. Did you know her? No, James said. I didn't know her. That was it. That was the entire weight of the interview. No physical evidence connected James to the room. No witness placed him there by name, only a vague description of an unidentified man walking with her that evening. Nothing specific enough to put against a face sitting across a table. Marquez had no reason to disbelieve him. A name. A flat denial. Nothing underneath it to push against. He wrote it down. He moved to the next name on the list. No fingerprints were taken that day. No swab. No hair sample. Nothing that could ever be compared against the towel and the shirt sitting in the evidence room down the hall, waiting for a comparison that would not come for 30 years. A man said 4 words, and an entire investigation let him walk out the door on the strength of those 4 words alone. By January 1989, 4 months after the murder, someone at the Santa Maria Police Department closed the file. They wrote 3 words on it. No further investigation. There was no press conference when that happened. No public statement. Nobody connected to that decision was ever named, then or since. What happened to that file afterward wasn't neglect exactly. It moved. Officer Begg opened it at some point in the early 90s, read through what was there, and found nothing new to add. He closed it again, in a building that had, across a stretch of years where almost everything else in Santa Maria moved forward except this one specific file. Meanwhile, April 2nd kept arriving on schedule. Ofelia Sandoval Alfaro turned 12 that way. Then 13. The candles changed, the cake changed. The people around the table changed as she grew older. But the date itself never lost the thing attached to it. 6 months ahead of the day her mother died, every single year. For the rest of her life. By the time she was old enough to have children of her own, April 2nd had become something she simply carried, the way you carry the shape of a room you grew up in even after you've moved out of it for good. In the early 2000s, technology finally caught up to what 1988 couldn't do. The California Department of Justice took the DNA preserved from that towel and that shirt, evidence that had been sitting untouched for over a decade, and used it to build something that hadn't existed before. A genetic profile. A precise, detailed outline of an unknown man, built from the smallest traces he'd left behind without knowing it. They ran that profile against everyone they could think to check. Ophelia's boyfriend. Her family members. Every name in every law enforcement database accessible to investigators in California and beyond. Nothing came back. Not one match. Anywhere. A complete, detailed, scientifically sound profile of a killer, and nowhere to put it. Not because the science had failed. The science worked exactly as it was supposed to work. It simply had nothing to compare itself against, because the one name that should have been tested against it had never been tested at all. In 2018, someone at the Santa Maria Police Department went back through that old file one more time. And this time, they noticed what every detective before them had missed for 30 years. Aloysius James had been interviewed. He had denied knowing her. And he had never, not once, been asked for a sample of his own DNA. 30 years. 4 words. Nobody had ever checked them. The FBI partnered with Santa Maria Police to fix that. But this time, they didn't go to James directly. They didn't ask him a question he could deny his way out of a second time. They watched him. At his workplace, going about an ordinary day, James pulled on a pair of nitrile gloves to do whatever task was in front of him. When he finished, he peeled them off and threw them in the trash, the kind of small, unremarkable motion a person makes 100 times a week without a single thought attached to it. That motion is protected by nothing. Under California v. Greenwood, a United States Supreme Court ruling decided that exact same year, 1988, the same year Ofelia died, there is no expectation of privacy in what a person discards in a public space. Once it's in the trash, it's not yours anymore in any legal sense. No warrant is required to collect it. That same legal principle, just months earlier in 2018, had helped confirm the identity of the Golden State Killer in California after more than 40 years of searching. Investigators there hadn't needed his permission either. They only needed him to throw something away, the way every person eventually does. Investigators didn't need James' permission. They only needed the gloves. A forensic analyst named Guerrero took the DNA recovered from those discarded gloves and compared it directly against the genetic profile pulled from the towel and the shirt 30 years earlier. The result: 78 sextillion times more likely than not that the DNA on the gloves and the DNA from the crime scene belonged to the same person, Aloysius James, the man who told Bill Marquez in 1988 that he had never met Ofelia Sandoval had, in fact, left himself behind on her body the entire time. He had been carrying the answer to his own denial inside him for 30 years, and nobody had ever asked to see it. In January 2024, investigators approached James directly and asked for a sample of his own DNA. He gave it voluntarily, perhaps believing, as he had believed for 36 years, that a denial and a sample would be enough to clear him one more time. It matched exactly. That April, before the arrest warrant was served, a district attorney's office investigator named Julia Tatarian flew across the country to Hall County, Georgia. In her hand, a photograph. A portrait of a woman she had spent years working to find justice for. A woman she had never once met in person, because Ofelia Sandoval had been dead since long before Tatarian ever opened the file that bore her name. She sat down across from James. She set the photograph down on the table between them, the same way Bill Marquez had once sat across from him in 1988 with nothing but a question. "Do you remember talking to detectives back in '88? She asked. James looked at the photograph. "Vaguely," he said. "I think they asked me if I know her. I didn't know her." Tatarian looked down at the photograph, then back up at him. "But your DNA was inside of her body," she said. "Your DNA matched to the DNA at the scene of the crime." He looked at the photograph again. The same denial came out of him one more time. The words that had worked for 36 years, the words that were about to fail him completely. "I didn't know her." On April 16, 2024, Santa Maria Police, the FBI, the Hall County Sheriff's Office SWAT team, and Gainesville Police arrived together at his home. He was arrested without incident. He was extradited back to Santa Barbara County that June and entered a not guilty plea at his arraignment. The trial began January 22, 2026. Senior Deputy District Attorney Ann Bramson led the prosecution. Defense attorneys Robert Sanger and Jessica Talavera represented James. By then, the case had grown old enough that the people who built it had begun disappearing the way people do across 38 years. Witnesses had retired. Some were too ill to take the stand. Retired Officer William "Bill" Spears, who had worked the case decades earlier as one of the long line of detectives who inherited that file, had died the previous fall. The jury never heard his voice in that courtroom. Instead, they watched a recorded interview, testimony taken in front of a judge while there was still time to take it, because someone understood that Spears wouldn't be there much longer to answer anyone's questions at all. In the courtroom, Robert Sanger stood in front of the jury and pointed to a gap in the case nobody had ever closed, a woven fabric belt, listed once in the original 1988 evidence log, never recovered, never explained. He held up the photocopy of the January 1989 note. 3 words, typed decades earlier by someone whose name appears nowhere in this case. No further investigation. He let the jury sit with that for a moment before he said what he wanted them to take from it: that a case mishandled at the start doesn't become solid just because enough years pass. DNA proves contact, he told them. It does not, on its own, prove who closed a hand around someone's throat. Then the recordings played. The courtroom went quiet in the specific way a room goes quiet when it's listening to someone's voice instead of a lawyer's. 1988. Marquez's voice, then James's. "No, I didn't know her." Then James was called to testify in his own defense, and for the first time since 1988, what came out of him wasn't a denial. He told the jury he and Ofelia had been intimate. He told them he lied about it both times, to Marquez, and again in 2024, because his father had been a pastor, and a confession like that wasn't something he could let exist on a recording. On February 27, 2026, The jury filed back into the courtroom. 10 men, 2 women. Judge Christy Immel had presided over the entire trial, but it was Judge John MacGregor sitting on the bench that afternoon, filling in specifically for the reading of the verdict. The court clerk stood and began to read. Guilty of first-degree murder. In the gallery, the people who loved Ofelia Sandoval, the contingent of relatives who had sat through every single day of this trial, began to cry before the clerk finished the sentence. Then the second finding. The jury had also been asked to decide a special circumstance, whether the killing had occurred during the commission of a rape or attempted rape. They had found that true as well. Aloysius James sat at the defense table in a wheelchair. He had used one for some time now. He did not turn around. He did not say anything. Whatever those 4 words had once been worth to him, in 1988, in an interview room with nothing yet to disprove them, and again in 2024, with a photograph already sitting on a table in front of him, they were worth nothing in this room, on this afternoon, with a clerk's voice still hanging in the air and a family crying in the seats behind him. Sanger told reporters afterward that he intended to file a motion for a new trial. April 2, 2026, came and went without ceremony. It would have been Ofelia Sandoval's 68th birthday. No one outside her family had any reason to know that. 12 days later, on the morning of April 14th, that same contingent of relatives who had filled the gallery in February walked back into a Santa Maria courtroom one more time. Judge Christy Immel was back on the bench. This hearing was hers to finish. Aloysius James was wheeled in and seated at the defense table again, the same posture, the same silence he'd carried since the verdict. This time, the family didn't just sit and listen. They stood, one at a time, and spoke directly into a room that had taken 38 years to let them say anything at all. Maricela Sandoval Alfaro stood first. The girl who had turned 11 years old days before her mother's murder was not a little girl anymore. She had grown old enough to watch her own children grow up entirely without ever knowing the grandmother who should have been there for all of it. It is impossible to understand how someone can commit such a horrific act, she told the court. I was just a little girl who desperately needed her mother. A letter from a granddaughter, someone who had never met Ofelia at all, who knew her only as an absence, as a name attached to a tragedy that predated her own birth by decades, was read aloud in that courtroom. She can finally rest in peace, the letter said. Margarita Vargas, Ofelia's sister, spoke last. I'm really hoping for all this to come to an end, she said, so I can rest. Judge Immel denied the defense motion for a new trial. Then she handed down the maximum sentence the law allowed, life in prison without the possibility of parole. This was an act of extreme violence committed during a sexual assault, she said. Today marks the culmination of almost 38 years of work on the murder of Ofelia Sandoval, the Santa Barbara County District Attorney's Office said afterward, and the beginning of some sense of closure for Ofelia's family. They named her 3 children specifically, Marcelino, Maricela, and Alex, calling their bravery, dedication, and resilience throughout decades of waiting truly remarkable. No one was ever publicly named for writing no further investigation on a file in January 1989. No one was ever held responsible for the 30 years that followed that decision, the 30 years during which a known name sat in a folder, untested, while the man it belonged to lived his life a few blocks away, and then a few states away. 38 years. That is how long it took for 4 words to finally stop working. But the file on Aloysius James is not finished, even now. Investigators have said they believe there may be other victims connected to him, threats, assault, abuse, never reported, never connected to him until this case finally put his name in front of the public after 36 years of anonymity. Police have continued releasing photographs of James taken across the decades, asking anyone who might recognize him from another place, another time, another version of the ordinary life he was living while Ofelia Sandoval's family waited to come forward. How many other answers belong only to him is a question this conviction does not close, and may never close. This case leaves behind 2 things worth carrying forward. First, A denial, on its own, is not an investigation, and a closed file is not the same thing as an answer. In October 1988, a man said 4 words to a detective, and those 4 words were treated as sufficient. 4 months later, with nothing more than that to go on, the case was marked closed. If you believe a case involving your own family or community was shelved too quickly, too early, before every name in the file was actually tested, you have the right to ask. You can request that evidence be preserved and resubmitted for testing as forensic technology continues to improve year after year. And that request can begin with your local police department's cold case unit or directly with the California Department of Justice's Bureau of Forensic Services, which exists specifically to handle exactly this kind of re-examination. Second, know precisely what the law protects, and just as importantly, what it does not. Under California v. Greenwood, anything a person throws away in a public space, a glove, a cup, a cigarette butt, anything discarded where anyone else could pick it up, carries no expectation of privacy once it leaves their hand. That principle, decided in 1988, the same year Ofelia Sandoval died, is the exact legal foundation that finally allowed investigators to test what they had suspected about Aloysius James for 30 years without ever needing his cooperation or his permission. If you want to understand your own state's specific rules on DNA collection, consent, and what counts as abandoned property under the law, your state attorney general's office can walk you through it directly. If this story made you think, please press subscribe so you don't miss the next case. Thank you for watching until the very end. The town center motel is gone now. It was demolished in 2013. Just an empty stretch of North Broadway today. Nothing marking what once stood there, nothing marking what happened inside it. But for 15 minutes on the evening of September 18, 1988, a man sat beside a woman, watching television, not yet knowing she was already gone. And for 36 years after that night, another man sat across from anyone who asked him about her, and gave them the same 4 words, every single time, without fail. He said them last with her photograph on the table directly in front of him. Ofelia Sandoval.